Right on. All right, well, I'll dive right in. Thank you, Masa, again for the introduction. Today I'm talking about DevTestOps, and just like DevOps or DevSecOps, it's just another one of those buzzwords, but the reason why I like this buzzword more so is just because it has the word test very literally in between dev and ops. And if you've ever seen a diagram of a pipeline, you always see the testing piece of the pipeline in the middle being the glue between dev and ops. And so it's really trying to put an emphasis on testing, not just for QA, but testing in general. So it's a buzzword I can get behind. I want to start off by a quote that I heard from a DevOps manager about a year ago, where they said, our mission in DevOps is to push high quality code to users faster or more quickly. And some people debate this, of course, because it's, well, wait a second, Agile isn't about being faster, and what about safely and things like that. But I think that the general feel of this vision statement is kind of what companies are trying to do. They are like, yeah, we want high quality stuff that's sent to our users as quick as possible. And so we started transitioning to Agile and trying to collaborate teams better. And so even at Jane, we have something very similar where instead of a feature team, we call it an experience team. But you'll notice that each one of these columns is a discipline or a profession, if you will, where we have our front end and back end. And you'll see that QA is one of them as well. And then each row is one of these feature teams. And so it looks awesome because, wow, you have all of these different disciplines working together and collaborating together. But there's something very bad about this diagram. And if you can't point it out already, I'll let you know there's only one QA engineer for 5 different people that are pushing things through. And so the problem with that is you have front end, back end, Android, iOS, all these different languages, all these different platforms pushing at the same time, and all of them with different speeds and cadences, and yet one tester that's meant to test all of them. And if you're a tester working on just mobile, you know how many platforms and OSs and devices you have to test. And so with only one person, it looks great saying, oh yeah, we have one tester for every 4 developers, when in reality, it's actually bottlenecking the rest of development. And so the testing manifesto was born. What we wanted to do was create guidelines and principles for QA engineers to be able to say, here's things that you should follow or principles you should follow that will help you in your testing efforts. So number 1, we value testing throughout over testing at the end, which sounds pretty awesome. Number 2, preventing bugs over finding bugs. Testing understanding over checking functionality. Some would say that checking functionality is very much what test automation does. Number 4 is building the best system over breaking the system. And lastly, team responsibility for quality over tester responsibility. So you would think that with something like this, especially the very last point, that you're taking the responsibility off of just the QA personnel and kind of divvying it across the rest of the team. There's good and bad in that. The good, obviously, is that you want the team to be collaborative. You want the team to focus on quality. But the bad thing is the value of the tester started going down, because if the rest of the team is doing it, why have the tester in the first place, right? Going on to the next thing, that's when Agile QA, or the shift left mentality, became a thing. The idea was, instead of having QA only in step 6 here, we wanted to involve QA as early as possible, sometimes even level 2 or 3. This was where QA could start asking their questions earlier on, which would facilitate conversations. It would lead to better collaboration and understanding, and we could start advocating for testing and testability much earlier on. So that way, during planning and development, they would build things with a little more testability and automatability in mind. And the best way to measure success at that point was then to know the fewer questions I have to ask as a tester at level 6 or step 6, the better your step 2, 3, 4, and 5 were. So again, awesome stuff. But in practice, or reality, if you will, QA was still a bottleneck, because you still have all of these platforms, all these different stacks moving at different paces. And so even though we wanted to involve QA earlier on, it actually added more work to the QA engineer because of all of the many more things they had to do. So I want to pose a question to you guys. Should QA engineers automate? This is a spicy question, and I'm sure I'm getting some different feelings just from showing the slide. But if you think about it, QA engineers are doing quite a bit. Here I just put 3, planning, triaging, and testing. And on top of that, you want them to start coding and automating as well. So should they be automating? Should they not? If so, can you support it? If not, then who's owning that? I'll answer it, but not right now. So what I'd love to do is introduce to you guys the DevTestOps Manifesto. Just like the Agile Manifesto and the Testing Manifesto, what we wanted was to create these very just concise principles to help testing in general. Again, the Testing Manifesto was meant for QA engineers. The DevTestOps Manifesto is meant for just testing in general as a development team. So if you guys don't already know Lisa Crispin, she's the author of Agile Testing and created testing in DevOps.org. I highly recommend you visit it, and I highly recommend you follow her on Twitter if you haven't already. But let's dive in. Number 1, continuous testing over testing at the end. This is more so talking about test automation, but just like the Testing Manifesto said, we want to be continually testing or testing throughout over testing at the end. Number 2, embracing all testing activities over automating everything. Number 3, testing what gives value based on customer usage over testing everything. Number 4, a whole team approach to testing over testing in siloed departments. And lastly, product coverage over code coverage. I love this just because it's so clear, so concise of what you should be focusing on as a team. And again, not just for QA engineering, because there's so much to cover. It's almost impossible for QA to own all the different testing activities. But I would like to start with this before we dive into each one of those pieces. Leading up and leading down. Leading down, obviously, is me as a manager. I have my QA engineers and automators, and I'm giving them direction, giving them support and guidance, and helping them out with that kind of stuff. Leading up is talking about me now reporting and communicating to my managers and my executives the things I'm trying to do. The reason why this is so crucial is because the only way for you to get support from management and support from development is to show them where you are and the progress you're making towards the end result that you want to have. So the way to start with this is in these 4 bullet points. Number 1 is honestly auditing where you are right now. I put the word honestly there because a lot of times people have a hard time saying I'm weak at something. Maybe you have thousands of test cases and half of them are obsolete and you don't really know what to do with them. I would tell you just to delete them, but some people would want to hold on to them or do something else with it. But honestly auditing where you are right now. Are you even at the place or maturity level where you can start automating, or do you still need to focus on manual coverage first? Number 2 is defining current baselines. A baseline, by definition, is a number or a line where you can then measure progress from. And so you need to understand, if I'm at 10% coverage right now, do I have full coverage on this checkout, on this feature, on logging in? Do you currently have baselines for them? If not, you need to get them. Number 3 is prioritizing that testing and creating a realistic roadmap for at least one product. One of the best ways to make sure that things are moving smoothly is to have very realistic expectations. It's part of the whole point of should QA engineers automate? Well, usually you'll have these very unclear or very unrealistic expectations, and it just sets the team up for failure. So prioritizing testing and having a realistic roadmap of here's where I am today, and in 3 months I want to be here. What does that roadmap look like? And then lastly, tracking and over-communicating that progress, not just with your team, but up the chain of command as well and to development. So testing what gives value over testing everything, and then product coverage over code coverage. The way that I handled this at Jane was I wanted to actually have visualizations. And this diagram right here is a visualization of one of the flows within our apps. And so if you've ever gone to jane.com, we're just an e-commerce site where you can buy products and whatnot. But this is one of our flows. I didn't create a diagram of our entire app. I just created a diagram for leaving a review. And these green boxes that you see on the purple boxes represent that we have a manual test covering this flow. So you'll notice that select fit and decide not to submit anything but star rating actually don't have any boxes. Once we created this diagram, it became very apparent to us that we had holes inside of this flow that we weren't covering. And so we made sure step 1, identify where we currently were. We created a baseline. Number 2, what's our plan for actually covering that? And we said we're going to cover that manually first and include it as part of our manual regression suite. The very next thing that we did was actually create a plan for how are we going to automate this so that way we can cover as much of this as possible. Now, as of today, we actually have these orange boxes on these purples, or the purple boxes. That is our automated test coverage. And so I can say to you right now that for leaving a review, I have 91% product coverage on leaving a review. And this chart that I've given to my management, they love it because it shows them very quickly, very concisely that we have this covered. And so even though it may not show exactly like the tests or the code itself of what tests are running, what they wanted to see was just a very clear representation, because that way my boss could say, let me send this to the CEO. So that way he feels confident that our stuff is being tested and covered with every release. The developers saw this as well. How can we be a part of this? How can we help out with test coverage? What things can we do to enable you to fill the rest of the spots up? Cancel review isn't covered right now. What can we do to help out? And it only brought the team together to help out with product coverage. The next bullet points, we had embracing all testing activities over automating everything, and the team approach to testing over testing in silos. So I created this very simple diagram. There's many of these on the internet, so I'm not going to claim that this is mine at all. But I created this very simple one just for my team and my development team to see, here are the pieces of testing, or the testing disciplines, if you will, that we want to have covered. And because my current team at Jane for QA engineers is just me as the automation architect, and then 2 QA engineers, there's no way for the 3 of us to cover all of these pieces. And so we have to bring in the rest of our team, right? We want to embrace all testing activities, but also have a team approach to all the testing as well. So for performance, we have some DevOps engineers that are very, very passionate about performance testing. And so they actually took that piece. So we gave that responsibility to them. For us in QA, we were going to take on manual, end-to-end UI, and some integration. The developers felt very strongly about having unit and service and even monitoring. And we saw a huge weakness on the right-hand side with security and compliance. We had very little support there. And I mean, very little expertise there even. And so we ended up hiring an entire SecOps team of 3 people to cover security, and even hired some lawyers and stuff to help us with compliance, things like accessibility and whatnot. And so instead of saying QA, it's up to you guys to cover everything in this pyramid and performance and monitoring and security and compliance, we said, where are we at currently? What realistically do we have access to? What are our resources actually? And how can we divvy up the responsibilities, because we need this coverage to move quickly? So lastly is that continuous testing. Test automation is the key to DevTestOps and DevOps, right? I don't want to take away from the fact that the QA engineering or manual testing is also important. It goes back to the embracing all testing activities, but test automation is the key. It's also a programming project, and so it needs to be treated like one. And I think this is where a lot of companies fail, is for management, with this being a programming project, well, you need to invest in it. You need to give proper support, resources, trainings, time. You need to invest in it just like you would a regular development app or project, because it's the exact same thing. For developers, you need to help support this programming project, whether it's helping with creating endpoints for testability, or even helping out with things like adding IDs to the website to help with the test automation. And then for QA engineers, with this being a programming project, if you want to help with test automation, then you have to learn coding. And so going back to the whole, should QA engineers automate? Well, I really hope that you guys have someone, an automation expert or architect, or someone who knows test automation well enough that they can build you something called the test automation infrastructure. This infrastructure is a platform to enable testing for all the different teams and departments within IT. So for example, if you needed to have iOS and Android create a user on the fly and put it into the backend database, you can either have a backend engineer or a test automation engineer create that user for you, create an endpoint and expose that endpoint, so that way the iOS engineers can actually create a user on the backend and put that into their test. So it's not just about test automation, it's about an infrastructure. And this is the whole takeaway. For test automation to be successful, you have to have test automation infrastructure. So test automation infrastructure should make it easy for anyone on the team to create, maintain, run, and consume your tests and test results. I can proudly say that here, I was the architect for this and built the infrastructure. And all of the difficult things, all of the complexity, I've abstracted away. And I've made it easy for my QA engineers who started with 0 programming experience to write the majority of our UI tests that we have now at Jane. Our Jane.com app is completely continuous deployment. And so once it gets approved, it will make it through our testing gauntlet, all of our automated tests, and deploy to production if it's successful. The majority of the tests within that were written by my 2 QA engineers who have 0 programming experience. That's what I'm talking about when I say it should be easy for anyone. Developers can write your tests with you. QA engineers can write your tests with you. Product owners, if they want to write tests, can do it as well. If it's that simple, your developers will love you, product will love you, your QA engineers will love you as well, because they'll actually be able to help out with automating. So, should QA engineers automate? If you can support it, yes. If they're willing to do it, yes. If you can actually set the realistic expectations for how long it takes to learn it and how to do it, yes, they should. If they don't want to, totally fine. You have to be able to support that mentality, and the infrastructure is how you do that. Well, that's it, guys. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please ask. Otherwise, you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn at Carlos Kidman.
All right, awesome. Very nice. Very, very nice. So I think that now everybody knows what I say, that you really like spreading the love.
Oh, yeah.
Very good. So Bill is he's taking care of the questions. So Bill, do you have anything over there?
Yeah, I certainly do. First of all, great presentation. I think you really hit some high points and some things are important. You've done a very nice job at work. So that's a great deal. So, how are you dealing with developers who, A, they think poorly of testing, and B, they don't want to do testing themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, the not wanting to do testing themselves is it's a different problem, because that is more so a culture kind of aspect, where if they don't want to do testing, then what they're basically saying, we don't want to do CI/CD, we don't want to do DevOps.
Right.
And so that's kind of a different thing. And the struggle with that is that could be something, it's usually not just one developer who has that mentality. It could be even higher up, where management doesn't want to give developers that responsibility. And so they say, well, QA should do all of the testing. And just like I talked about, that is already setting up the QA team to fail if the QA team can't support that. If they don't have the programming ability to be able to actually cover the entire pyramid,
Right.
it's going to take them a long time to get those tests up and running. And the problem with that is the longer it takes, the less credibility you get, or it's perceived credibility, right, that you get from outside of QA. And that only hurts the QA team. And so,
absolutely.
Yeah,
you're right. And I think you actually brought some points throughout your presentation that spoke to that. So I highly recommend for any the folks that are going to be listening to or present to listen to the presentation, to share it with your leadership, because I think it will answer a lot of the questions that they have. So I think the next question is, how can we educate executives on the importance of test first?
Of testing first?
Yeah.
Well, let me give you an example of, remember how I talked about the leading up and leading down?
Yeah.
What makes it difficult for executives, and I've seen this before as well, but it's understanding what successful test automation looks like. Because it's easier to see successful development, quote unquote, if you will, just because they probably have seen it or they have experienced it in some way. And it's a little more linear, where in QA, it just seems so nebulous and it's more harder to define and track. And it's the reason why test automation is so valuable and so important, is because with it being a programming project, you now have that linear baseline of here's where we're at right now and here's how we're moving up. And so what you want to be able to show is that value. But how do you show value from QA engineering and test automation? And that's where that product coverage comes into play. What you want to do is show, here's our current product. Here's the pieces that we feel are most valuable. And here's how we're going to be covering them. It used to take us 10 hours to regress this with 5 people. And now because we've invested 5 hours in test automation, it's now reduced the amount of time to 5 hours running the entire suite. And just showing that already shows the value that you guys are giving back to the business, and it starts to pique their interest. For a developer, one of the best ways to get them to start caring about things like testability is to have them actually write a test for you. And I really hope that you can get a developer to actually do this. But I actually did that here at Jane when I first started out. We would have developers say, it takes too long to write IDs. It takes too long to get that and do a PR and push it up. And so we don't want to create IDs. And so I said, well, we can do it for you guys because it's super easy to do. And then we can submit a PR and include you guys in it so you can do the code review and everything. And they're like, okay. Another developer, we actually said, could you write the UI test for us then? And he started writing the test, and magically IDs started appearing on the website because he was getting frustrated with how difficult it was to automate things. And so he started adding IDs himself to make it more testable. And so like getting them to empathize with you is also super helpful, but it's also nice for QA to empathize with development as well, because they also have a lot of struggles that we may not be aware of. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding both sides rather than pointing a finger and saying it's you guys' fault that QA is failing.
Right. Very good. Here's another one for you. As a tester, how can I know what to focus on when I'm included after the interaction with the customer and the requirements have been created?
So the whole point when I talked about the product coverage over code coverage and then talked about testing what gives value based on customer usage, that's a skill set that we in QA have to have. And I hope that it's something that you have a team or you have access to things like the analytics or people that are experts in that domain, whether it's user research or data science, because they should know what pieces are more important to the users than not. As a tester, part of our testing mindset, if you will, is to be able to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of a user and advocate for them and try it out the way that they would use it. And so for you as a tester, what do you feel is the most important piece of that feature or more important pieces of that app or flow? And if you have data to actually back that up, then it's very easy for you to then get support from other people. If it's just you saying, well, I think this is the most important because it feels like the most important, and that's all you have, then that's very much considered just exploratory testing at that point, because you're just exploring that aspect of the app rather than having it be more data driven where you're saying this is most important because of X, Y, Z. And it's easier to get support when you have data like that rather than I feel like this is more important than this other one, and you don't really have a tangible reason why.
So, and this one is kind of like Bill asking you a question. I think it's appropriate to everybody else, and that is, how are you collecting data so you can actually operate from data-based information, which then will support up and downstream?
Yeah, so here we do have user researchers and data scientists and data analysts. We use different apps and tools. So for example, we have things like, even on the marketing side, with things like Google Tag Manager and then analytics. We also have an app called Full Story where it actually keeps track of user sessions, and we can actually see heat maps. I don't know if you noticed that product coverage map I showed you guys had different shades of purple. It was actually a heat map, so we could see which flows were more used than others. And so that's how we were able to determine which things were more important or more valuable based on our customers' usage rather than our perception of what they're doing. And so that's how we gather our information, and we are constantly talking with our user research team and data science team to determine what pieces we need to test more or test more thoroughly, because otherwise we're going to be kind of shooting in the dark and saying, well, automate everything or test everything because we don't know what's higher priority than the other thing. So
right, but I was really referring more to pre-release to the customer and the customer using it. As you're developing your testing and what to test and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of things like the continuous testing and DevOps, right? Is the whole point is for you not to release something every year, right? What you do is that you release something, or you do something like A/B testing, where you can actually try stuff out and get feedback. Things like betas, even a beta program is also helpful, because then you could actually try things out before releasing it to the entire public, and that's goes back into that bucket of embracing all testing activities, because if you really want to gauge what users are doing, well, you have to give it to the users first, right?
Of course.
So those are other ways of doing it. Otherwise, you just do the very small iterations. You try something, you throw it out there, and you say, we think this is what users want. They may not even know what they want yet. We're going to try this and innovate. And then they may come back and say, this is a pile of garbage. and you go, crap, well, now you learned. Pivot and try something else again.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.